rest of the universe was expanded outward on day two, and it separates water below from waters above, then it suggests several things. Number one, since it's came off the Earth and there's water up there, then there has to be an edge to space.
All I could see was this light coming in.
The Holy Spirit went. It blew into me.
I have never been the same since then.
That was it. I'm done.
I was born again.
Welcome to Very Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Samuel Delgado, and this is episode 93. I talked to astronomer Danny Faulkner from Answers in Genesis. We get into cosmology. So we talk about stars. Day two, we look at the separating from the waters above from the waters below, and what exactly is the firmament or expanse that we see in between. We look at the waters above being a possible explanation for what the cosmic microwave background is. We talk about aliens and the likelihood of their existence. We talk a little bit about dark matter and speculate there. And then lastly, we take a look at constellations and we answer the question, is there any validity to the gospel in the stars theories that we see out? So very interesting episode. With no further ado, let's get weird. Thanks again for coming on. Again, I'm just so psyched to have you on. I found you through the Is Genesis History conference. You did several lectures for that, and you did one lecture that had something to do with the second day of creation. And you made this comment that actually brought me back to one of my earlier interviews I did on my podcast. Another guest mentioned which we'll get into later, the cosmic microwave background. And I thought, oh my goodness! So I had to reach out, and so this is very exciting to talk about this today. So before we kind of get going, please just give us a little bit of background on who you are, and how you got into astronomy.
Well, I'm the astronomer now at Answers in Genesis. I've been here a little over 10 years. I do have a PhD in astronomy from Indiana University, and in between that and coming to work at Answers in Genesis, I was a professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where I taught astronomy and physics for more than a quarter century. I had an opportunity to retire a little early, more than a decade ago, and I took that opportunity. I was very happy there, by the way. I was a full professor. I was tenured. I was doing quite well. But I felt a calling to come here, to work here. I always thought in my mind, if I ever retired from the university, I wouldn't want to just be the end of that. I wanted to go on and do creation work full time. And if you're going to do that at all, you better do it sooner rather than later. If you wait until like 70 when you retire, that doesn't leave you too much time. So It's worked out really well. I've done a lot of research over the years with the eclipsing binary stars. My first observations on those were 45 years ago, published in the literature. My interest in astronomy goes back before I started school. I remember we lived at a place when I was not quite 5, probably. We moved away shortly after I turned 5. This would have been in the summer. And I remember sitting on the front stoop and looking up in the sky and being fascinated with the stars up there. I might have only been 3, I don't know, but that was pretty young. I hadn't started school for another year yet, and just being fascinated with it. And growing up, I was like that. But it wasn't until the 10th grade, sophomore year of my high school years, that then several things came together that year. And one of them is I decided that was my calling in life, to be an astronomer for God's glory. And that's been my track now for over a half century. And so I'm very happy to be a person sharing the wonder of God's creation and explaining some things, I think, biblically and physically and from the science we know, to see how the heavens do declare God's glory. And so I think that's what I was made to do, and I feel very fulfilled knowing that I'm doing what I was made to do.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's so cool that it started at such a young age for you. We see the scriptures talk about the heavens declaring the glory of God, and it's an amazing thing that no matter where you are in the world, you have access to the night sky, and immediately elicits wonder as far as some big questions of who we are in the world and how we got here. So yeah, I've had those thoughts myself, and I've had a fascination with astronomy, but I've never really studied it even at a low level. So I'm excited to sort of pick your brain here. One thing that we see that's popular, or at least a teaching that I've heard in reference to biblical cosmology, is a three-tiered cosmology with the heavens above, the earth below, and then the netherworld underneath. Is this an accurate and true understanding of biblical cosmology?
Well, the way I've understood the three-tiered cosmology is not quite how you described it, but the first heaven being right above us, where the clouds are, where weather occurs, where birds fly. The second heaven being the astronomical realm, where the sun, the moon, the stars are, and then the third heaven being God's abode. I think that's not really taught clearly in Scripture. The only reference to that is the Apostle Paul speaking in the New Testament, saying he was drawn up to the third heaven, or a man was taken to the third heaven. Clearly, it's talking about himself, and it's that is the only direct allusion to that sort of thing. I think that three-tiered cosmology was pretty common in the ancient world, particularly in the ancient Roman world, probably the Greeks before them. You can see hints of it in Scripture, and I think that's where people kind of read that into it, because it does speak of the heavens in different ways. It talks about the birds of heaven flying, it talks about the clouds in heaven, it talks about the stars in heaven, and in heaven, where heaven of heaven, where God exists. So I think that's what the three-tiered cosmology is, and while that is not clearly taught in Scripture, it is, I think, consistent with the usages we find in those things. I've come to start saying that the cosmology of the Bible is not real clear. It's a little vague.
Mm-hmm.
The cosmogony, that is the history of how God made it, is pretty clear there in Genesis 1. But the cosmology itself is not that clear.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. Okay. So that kind of gets us into day 2 of creation. That's where we see the waters below being separated from the waters above, and then in the midst we have what some translations say a firmament, some translations say an expanse, some more modern translations just say sky. So what is your understanding of day 2 with the separation of the waters and the what's in the midst of the two waters?
Yeah, the Hebrew word of contention there is rakia, and it is translated in King James and other older English translations as firmament. And again, as you've already pointed out, more modern translations say expanse for the most part, and a few say heaven or sky is good. I wrestled with this for quite some time. It's been in the past decade that I've come around to a good understanding. I believe I was a little baffled for quite a while, but the word rakia only occurs 17 times in the Old Testament. And whenever you see a word you're not quite sure what it means, it helps to look at the other places it's used. The only problem is I'm concerned about the creation account in Genesis 1, particularly in day 2, where I think it appears 5 times. And the problem is 9 of the 17 times occur in Genesis 1, the very passage I'm trying to figure out what it means.
Right. Yeah.
So the majority of them are right there. It's mentioned twice in the Psalms and once in the book of Daniel. It appears six times, I believe, in the book of Ezekiel, but chapters 1 and chapter 10. But I'm convinced after deep study on this that it's talking about something very different there. It's not talking about the thing God made on day 2. My reason for saying that is when it's introduced in verse 6 of Genesis 1, it says, and God said, let there be a rakia in the midst of the waters. And in English, we put that indefinite article in there. Now, ancient Hebrew doesn't have indefinite articles, so it literally reads, and God said, let there be rakia. Now, there are definite articles in Hebrew, just like in English, we say the for something. And right after that, every usage in chapter 1, it uses that definite article, the rakia, or the expanse, or the firmament. And that parallels what we read in the English. But when, and by the way, you find that in the twice in Psalms and in Daniel, it says the firmament, the rakia. But when you get to Ezekiel, it introduces that. It's trying to describe the indescribable. He's in the presence of God in the heaven of heavens, and he said there was something over the head of this beast, something like a rakia. Notice the indefinite article in English. There is no definite article there. It's absent in Hebrew because they don't have that. Right. And immediately after that, it uses the definite article. So it tells me it's introducing something new at this point. Furthermore, it says it isn't a rakia. It doesn't say it is the rakia. It says it's like a rakia. So it's a simile. It's drawing a similarity to this thing of rakia, whatever it is. And you would do the same sort of thing in English. When you introduce something, you generally use the indefinite article, and after that, you use the definite article. For instance, you could say, I built a house. Notice I use the indefinite article. And the house was made of brick, and the house had 3 bedrooms, and the house had 2.5 baths. Notice after I introduce it, I use the definite article once you've introduced that point. So that language, that logic still works in Hebrew, I do believe. So when you get to Ezekiel, it's talking about something very different from the rakia created on day 2. Now, we do know from verse 8, it says that God called the rakia shemayim, which is a Hebrew word for heaven. So it says in the English, God called this firmament or expanse heaven. And then in the day 4 account, it says that 3 times it says there that God placed the heavenly bodies in this expanse of heaven, this rakia of Shemayim, as it were. And I have to wonder why it was done 3 times, why the 2 were put together with a preposition in between. And I think it's for emphasis to let us know it's important. I think God is signaling to us here that whatever it was he made on day 2, that is where he put the heavenly bodies. That's pretty clear to me. And I think people in the past have understood that. And this is where a large part of the confusion about the meaning of this Hebrew rakia comes about. In the probably 3rd century BC, there was a need for the Old Testament, the Bible, to the Hebrews to be in their native language. At that point, because of the diaspora, there were Jews scattered all around the known world there, the Roman world, and even to Babylon and beyond, that many of them didn't speak or read Hebrew anymore, and they needed to read their scriptures. And so a group of scholars gathered together in Alexandria in northern Egypt, and they translated the Old Testament into Greek, from the Hebrew to the Greek, and we call this the Septuagint. It's usually abbreviated by the Roman numerals for 70, LXX. And interesting, when they got to that, they translated it stereoma, which is a Greek word referring to something hard. And I believe what they were doing is that they were incorporating the Greek cosmology. Keep in mind that Alexandria was the major city of Greek learning and culture. The great library was there. And back at that time, 2,300 years ago, this was the cosmology the Greeks held to. You've got a spherical Earth down inside there. It's just a model of course. A little Earth in there. And you've got this hard plastic sphere. Now, they thought it was made out of crystal material, maybe glass or quartz or something. If you look carefully there, you can see little yellow dots on there. Those represent stars. This big yellow ball represents the sun. And I can spin this around like this. And this represents the motion of the stars in the heavens. And so 2,300 years ago, this was the cosmology that the translators of the Septuagint were exposed to and probably accepted. It was the science of their day. Yeah. And they said, look, if God made this rakia on day 2, and if he placed the heavenly bodies in that rakia on day 4, then we know what this rakia is. It's a hard crystalline sphere that surrounds the earth, completely surrounds it. And by the way, we still use this model today. It's very useful. Nobody believes it anymore, I don't think, but we use that because the stars are so far away. They appear to be little this little dots of light very about the same distance from us. By the way, and that this is out of scale. This model, the ancients thought the radius of this thing was like 20,000 times the radius of the Earth, so it was huge. So I think what they did is they translated the Rakia into Greek in a way that they thought they were doing the right thing, because that was the cosmology of the day, and it remained the cosmology for the next almost 2,000 years. About 400 years ago, people finally abandoned that for roughly what we believe today. Well, you go forward from the Septuagint to Jerome around I believe around the 5th century AD, so like 600 years afterwards. He was doing the same thing the Septuagint translators were doing, because the church at that point, a lot of them spoke Greek originally, because they were living in a Greek-influenced world, and they had the Greek New Testament, they had the Greek Old Testament in the form of the Septuagint. But by the 5th century AD, at least in the western part of the Roman Empire, people weren't speaking and reading Greek anymore. They were doing the Latin. That was the international language. And so Jerome very famously translated both the Old and New Testament into Latin. And the Latin word that Jerome picked for the for the Rakia was firmamentum. And if you have any questions about what that means, just look at the first 4 letters, F-I-R-M. It's something hard. And I think what he was doing is he was still believe this cosmology, and he did a very good job of translating stereoma, but he did a lousy job on translating what the Rakia actually means in Hebrew.
Sure.
And then you go more than 1,000 years later, once again, you have the same sort of problem. Christians now weren't reading Latin anymore. There was a need to translate the Bible into the common language. And so you have John Wycliffe 700 years ago translating the Bible into English. He did not, unlike Jerome and the Septuagint translators, he didn't know Hebrew, didn't know Greek, but he did work from the Vulgate. He knew Latin. And when he got to the firmament, he transliterated that word and just put it into English as firmamentum to firmament. And that is created a new English word basically by doing that. Yeah, and, in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, sometimes you'll see a really difficult word. And usually what that means is the translators didn't know how to translate it, so they transliterated. The Nephilim is one example of that. It's a Hebrew word that was transliterated rather than translated because they had difficulty understanding what it meant.
Yeah.
And the early English translations followed that. Now, that tells you the story of how we got from Rakia to firmament in English. And if you ask any Hebraist, and I know some world-class Hebraists, and I've asked them, if you look in the lexicons, they will tell you that the word Rakia means expanse. They get this from the verb from which that noun is created, but they also get it from looking at other extra biblical sources, looking at related ancient Semitic languages that are related to Hebrew. They can figure out the meaning pretty well, and it means expanse. A few years ago, I met a person who is Israeli, and they speak Hebrew. And I asked him, I said, "What does Rakia mean to you?" And he said, "It means sky." So I think the idea is this Rakia is something that is above us, everything that's kind of above us. And that would include where the clouds and birds are. It would include where the astronomical bodies are and so forth. See, the problem is today we have modern terminology. We have the atmosphere, we have space.
Right.
Yeah. Those are very modern concepts. Yeah. We've grown up with it, but 400 years ago, those weren't even talked about yet, I don't think. They're pretty modern. And so to a modern man, you would identify the first heaven with the atmosphere, and a second heaven with space, as we call it. But we got to be very careful we don't make the same mistake that the Septuagint translators did by reading in our cosmology into it. I'm trying to share what I understand of this meaning of day 2 creation in terms of what people today would understand, what they would talk about. So that's my position I've come to, that the Rakia made on day 2 is basically everything above the Earth, what we would call atmosphere and space today. But the astounding thing is there that apparently the beginning of creation in day 1, when God created the Earth, it was pretty small. It was just the Earth and not anything else outside of that. And that's really different from what I thought a decade ago. Back then, I thought there was space created on day 1 and the Earth was made. I think even space itself didn't really exist as we know it back then on the beginning of creation. It took day 2 to get that.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So yeah,
I know it's a lot to unpack.
no, yeah, it's just that last comment really got me thinking, because I don't know if it was your lecture that I was listening to or another, but the concept that the opening verse, in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, is the creation of that. When he creates the heavens, the space exists, the earth exists, and then from there, light. So I guess my question is, what do you make of the statement, in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, if you don't think that the heavens were there until after?
Excellent question. Henry Morris and John Wickham, who are the co-founders of the modern creation movement 6 decades ago, were the opinion that was the creation of space in the primordial Earth at that point. And I subscribed to that for a long time myself, but I don't think my examination, I don't think it really stands up well. I've come to the conclusion that a large part of that is heaven and earth. Well, let me back up just a second. You have God. If you say that God created the heavens in verse 1, then God makes this rakia on day 2, and in verse 8 he says, "And God called this expanse heaven." So did God create heaven twice on day 1 and day 2? That's a bit of a problem now, isn't it?
Sure.
And the way that Morris and Whitcomb solved that is they said, well, the first one was the second heaven, space. The mention of the expanse in day 2 was the first heaven, the atmospheric heaven, and they used this to support what we call the canopy model, the idea that there's water above the Earth's atmosphere, that they are invoked as being one of the sources of the waters at the time of the great flood of Noah. There's several problems with this biblically and physically. Very quickly, one of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 1. It's maybe 150, 148, 149, or 150. It says, "Praise ye all heavens, waters above the heavens." Is that which psalm is that?
It's Psalm 148, verse 4.
Verse 6, verse 4.
Praise him,
okay.
Ye heavens of heavens, and ye waters that be above the heavens.
Yeah, and if this is obviously I think a post-flood psalm. And so it mentions the waters above the heavens that are still there after the flood. So that's a problem with the canopy model. Plus, when it talks about the birds flying in the open face or on the face of the heavens there in verse 20, the first verse of the day 5 account, it's talking about that inner face, an inner surface of that rakia. It's not talking about the birds flying in the rakia. The stars and the sun and the moon are in the rakia, but the birds are somehow on the inside edge of the near face of that. The language there in verse 20 suggests something very different from what preceded it on day 4. So I think, with all due respect to Wickham and Morris, and I knew both men, they were both marvelous men, but they're human like you and me, and that we do make mistakes. I think that they were wrong about that. Respectfully, I disagree with them. I think it's a better fit to understand that the birds are flying on the near side of it, what I might call the atmospheric heaven or the first heaven. So that is my position, because I think it's more consistent with all of this. So what's going on in verse 1 where it says God created heaven and the earth? Well, I think it can mean several things. One possibility is maybe it's a merism. A merism is where you use two extremes to talk about everything. If you say, I looked high and low, does it mean that you looked up here and you looked down here and nowhere in between? Well, no, it meant you looked high and low and everywhere in between of that. It's a merism. And heaven and earth is a merism in Hebrew. They don't have a word for universe. And we even pick that up in English now. We talk about moving heaven and earth. We're talking about doing everything possible. It's a merism encompassing everything. So I think perhaps Genesis 1:1 is, in the beginning, God created everything. And then he continues on with the creation account over 6 days to describe how he did it in some detail. It's some people call this an introductory encapsulation, and there are examples of this in the book of Genesis where a statement is given to introduce an account, and then details follow. And I think this is what's going on here.
Yeah, gotcha, perfect. Yeah, just to clarify, the Psalm 148 verse you're saying is detailing the floodwaters, not waters above what we would.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
Okay,
I'm saying
okay.
if the canopy model were correct, then the waters above the atmosphere was being created on day two. If that's what it is, then all those waters are not there anymore, and yet Psalm 148 refers to them. So this is this is a nice segue into the weird cosmology, and just rocked my world a few years ago when I finally came to grips with this, because if what I'm saying is correct, that the space, as using a better term, just space, the rest of the universe was expanded outward on day two, and it separates water below from waters above, then it suggests several things. Number one, since it came off the earth and there's water up there, then there has to be an edge to space. And that's anathema to modern cosmology. The idea of having an edge to the universe is just beyond the pale. Nobody can really comprehend that, and I can't either. But hey, we're talking about the miracle of creation and God doing it. If he says he did it, then he did it.
Right.
We don't have to understand it. Sure. And number two is, since it was expanded off of the earth, then that kind of suggests the earth is somewhere near the middle of the center of the universe. I'm not saying it has to be exactly at the center, but it's pretty close enough in this case. Am I a geocentrist? Yeah, in one sense I am. I think I'm a universal centric person. I believe the universe is centered on the earth. And then here's the really weird part, is the fact that, by the way, that's anathema to modern cosmology too. If there is a center, well, they doubt that's the case, but if there is, what's the probability of the Earth being anywhere near the center? Well, if you believe in random processes, vanishingly small. But if you believe in special creation, well, suddenly it's possible we could be there. And the third thing is that at the edge of the universe, there must be water. And that's, again, makes no sense in modern cosmology. That's the third thing that just kind of rocks my world. And so I think there's actually a shell of water at the edge of the universe. Why is it there? Well, I don't know. God saw fit to do it. And some of my creation brethren have agreed with me on this. They came to the conclusion by different avenues from me. And a lot of them like to say, well, maybe it's ice or gas, solid or gas, because the conditions won't support liquid water at that point. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. What do you mean the conditions, the physical conditions? What kind of physical conditions exist at the edge of the universe? Please write me an equation for that.
Sure. Yeah.
But on top of that, the Hebrew word for water is mayim. And by the way, when I say the word water, do you really think of ice or steam? I never do.
No.
When I mean ice or steam, I say ice or steam. I might say snow or whatever, hail or whatever, but I won't use the word water. When we say the word water, we generally think of H2O and it's liquid form.
Liquid, yeah.
And I think the same is true in the Hebrew, because there are words for ice in Hebrew and there are words for vapor. So consequently, if God wanted to get across the idea that there was vapor or ice at the edge of the universe, he could have done so, but he didn't. He said water, which translates well to English, the word mayim into water. There's water at the edge of the universe. And that, again, is, I don't know why the Lord did that, but that's what he said he did. Now, this will segue very nicely into something. This is just really a further thing that rocked my world. Is, I started giving talks about creation probably 3 decades ago, early 90s, I'm going to guess. And one of the talks I gave early on was talking about the Big Bang. And I don't subscribe to the Big Bang. That's been the standard cosmogony for over a half century now, and widely accepted. But the idea is that it's physically, I think, has some problems, but also biblically has some real problems. The age fitting in, stars before the sun and so forth, for the earth and so forth, being problems. So I reject the Big Bang on biblical and scientific grounds. But the one evidence for the Big Bang that really turned everything around back in the mid-1960s was the discovery of what we call the cosmic microwave background, or CMB for short. And it's believed to have come from a time when the universe, about 380,000 years after the Big Bang, which itself was supposedly 13.8 billion years ago. So this is pretty quickly after the Big Bang. It's only 380,000 years. And it was a time when the universe was about 3,000 degrees Kelvin. and it was pretty hot and dense, and it was opaque. But when as the universe expanded, it cooled, got less dense, and it reached that point where it was transparent for the first time, which allowed light to just suddenly decouple from matter. Before that, light was being absorbed by matter, re-emitted, reabsorbed, re-emitted, and it finally became transparent, like the universe was foggy, and then it became transparent, and the light streaks off. And so here we are 13.8 billion years later, and everywhere we look, we would see a wall of radiation that's been cooled by a factor of about 1,000 since then, because the expansion of the universe has taken place. And that was discovered in 1964, published in early 65. And it was predicted in 1948, its existence in the microwave part of the spectrum. The technology didn't yet exist then to detect it, but by the 60s it did. And this was hailed as the great proof or evidence for the Big Bang. And today it remains, I think, the only single evidence for the Big Bang, to tell you the truth. And it was so earth-shattering. A dozen years later, Arnold Penzias and Robert Wilson received the Nobel Prize in Physics for their discovery. Now, I give this discussion, I talk about this and some problems with the CMB, and people would ask me, well, if the CMB is not from the Big Bang, what is it from? And for 20 years or more, I didn't have an answer to that question. It's a good question. I had to tell them, but I don't have an answer. Mm-hmm. Well, after I started developing this cosmology, I'm writing it up to publish in the creation of literature. And one morning, I'm sitting right here in this very office, about 8:30 in the morning. I said, wait a minute. And I realized that there's a shell of water at the edge of the universe. Water is made of normal, what we call baryonic matter. And according to the third law of thermodynamics, it must have a non-zero temperature if you apply it properly there. And normal matter that has non-zero temperature must radiate. And it's given great distance away, it's probably going to be redshifted. So I would expect from this cosmology, there should be a radiation field coming from all directions in space from that water at the edge of the universe, which is exactly what we see. So I wasn't trying to answer that question of what the CMB was. I was simply trying to develop a biblical cosmology, and this just tumbled right out. Yeah. Now, I would think that if somebody would have taken the biblical account of creation seriously as I did and apply a little bit of physics, they could have predicted the CMB prior to its discovery.
Before discovering, yeah.
I'm off the hook. I was in 5th grade at the time. So, I don't think I was quite ready to take that one on. Yeah. But I did kind of predict it after the fact. I can explain it now at least, and that's my explanation for the CMB.
Wow, that is remarkable, man. And like I said earlier in the interview, that's what sparked me. We just wanted to sit down and talk to you. So I want to chase that a little bit further. But before I do that, I want to back up to day 2. And I'm interested to see if you have any thoughts on this. When we look at the creation account, we see the statement of God seeing it, and he makes a judgment that it was good. He does not make that statement on day 2. And in fact, it's the only day where that is absent, the judgment of it being good. Is there any significance in the fact that nothing on day 2 is declared good?
Yes, I think there's a tremendous amount of significance. That's another clue as to, I think, what's going on in the day 2 account. The goodness, and at the very end of the week, God declares things very good. That goodness refers to completeness, that everything is functioning the way God intended it. It's fulfilling the purposes that God had for them. And what he did on day 2 is he created a environment for the heavenly bodies and for the birds, for that matter, but neither one of them were there. In verse 2, it says, and the earth was without form and void. That's an English translation. A better English translation would be, reflecting the Hebrew, tohu and buhu, is unfilled and unformed. God had, when he initially created the earth and everything else, it was unformed. It was in a kind of a primordial state, and it was unfilled because he hadn't filled it with animals and plants and people and stars. Yeah. So he couldn't say that about the day 2 creation because it wasn't quite complete. It was an environment, but there was nothing in it apparently. And it wasn't until day 4 that he put the heavenly bodies in. Then he says it's good. And day 5, he puts the flying things in, and it's good. And finally, at the end of the week, it's declared very good. So I think that's the significance of that, and I think it jives very well with my interpretation I'm giving to this. And it's you're correct that it is the one day that it's not actually stated.
Wow. No, that is very interesting because, wow, yeah, because on day 1 we have the declaration that's prior to day 2. Day 3 we see separates the water from the land, and then we see trees sprout up, right? So that land that's there is occupied, right, with
it's
vegetation.
Formed and filled on day 3.
Formed and filled, yeah. And then, wow, that's fantastic. I love that. Okay, so I love, first let me say I love the fact that that we can just look at what the Bible says, and if it says there's waters above, that should be just the plain interpretation of that. As you already mentioned, the canopy model. Once you read that psalm, I came across that maybe a couple of years ago, and it really strikes you. And you can't read that psalm, that verse, without going back to day 2 and hearing the waters being separated, the ones from above and below. And so I do like that we can just make Scripture say exactly what it says. I had a guest. This was, I think, my 7th episode. So it's, I don't know, over 2 years ago when I had this guest on. It was one of the weirdest episodes I've done. Also one of the least popular episodes I've ever done. And it was, there were some bizarre things that were said, but I remember I reached out to him because of what he had to say about the cosmic microwave background, which is something, I think that was my introduction to it. I hadn't even heard of it prior to this. So I get his book, I read it, and listen to some interviews where he talks about it. And he mentioned that when it was discovered, the signal that discovered it, if you listen to it, it's static noise.
Yeah. And
his theory, and what he did, I think we did it on the episode towards the end. Again, is why I had him on. He played the static noise, and then he played the sound of rushing water. So it was just like what's the huge falls in the U.S.
Niagara.
He played Niagara, and it was just, that's all it was. And they were almost completely indistinguishable, the static and the sound of the rushing waters. So my question for you is that possibly what we're hearing when we listen to static?
Tricky. In order to do that, it's a radio signal. Microwaves turns out very short wavelength radio, and you have to have some sort of method to convert that frequency of radio into sound. And unfortunately, I think you can make it almost do anything you want by doing that. There's no signal per se, like we're speaking right now. And if you broadcast this over a radio station, you can decompose the signal and make sense out of the speech we're using. But this is truly a random generation. It would come across as static, but how do you take that and turn it into an audible sound? That's the real question. With AM and FM and other types of radio, things are encoded into the wave, but there's no coding here. So I think it may be just the way you decide you want to convert that into sound, and that could be a reading a lot more into it than is really there.
I gotcha. Yeah. So at the time, I had no idea how to make any sense of what he was saying. I could certainly agree that they sound the same, right? But I just didn't know if there was any validity. I would question that based on how the sound is being produced, how you're decoding that thing. That would be my problem with it. Yeah. The second thing he did is he looked at it visually. He looked at pictures of the CMB and it, I guess the radiation, and compared it to like a satellite picture of waters from above, and they also looked almost identical, which I also found intriguing, but then again, didn't know if there was any validity behind it either.
Yeah, I don't know what that's all about. There are some features in it. It's they were expecting it to have slightly warmer and cooler regions on it that go back to that early epoch in the evolutionary universe, and they have found small temperature fluctuations on the order of 1 part in 100,000. I mean, it's a very smooth sort of thing. But there are two features on it which are hard for them to explain. One is called the axis of evil. It is a long ridge, as it were, of warmer than average temperature. It's just slightly warmer, like 1 part in 100,000 again, but it's very long. It extends for about 60 degrees. And what's really weird is that that 60-degree long line coincides very closely with the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun. And if this is truly a cosmic microwave background due to the edge of the universe in the Big Bang cosmology, why is this long line there that they can't explain? Why is it aligned with the Earth's orbit around the sun, which makes no sense? But if it's from stuff expanded off the Earth, then you might find something imprinted into it.
Wow.
That would be consistent with the Earth, whatever the Earth is doing. I'm
Sure.
not predicting this. I'm simply saying that we can account for that. You can't account for it in the Big Bang right now.
Yeah.
So that's one of the weird features, the axis of evil. If people want to look it up, there's a Wikipedia page on it. There's also a thing called the Great Cold Spot. And that's a cooler than average region, a little below that. That one I have no idea what it is, but both features are too big to be explained in typical Big Bang cosmology.
Interesting. Yeah. And going to your point earlier, what you mentioned about the Earth being the center of the universe, and it's always an argument for people when they talk about space aliens. They always say, oh, because space is so big, they just assume that we're not alone, that sort of thing. But if you read Genesis 1:1, God creates the heavens and the earth. So earth is very distinct. We're comparing all of the heavens and the earth. So it's not a leap at all, I think, to say that the earth is the center of the universe. It's the focus of Genesis 1.
If not the geographical center of the universe, it is certainly the center of God's attention, because we're the center
Yes.
of God's attention.
Yes.
And this kind of swerves into aliens, and that's something that evolution have to talk about, because if we are the result of a long string of cosmic accidents, the universe happened, the stars happened, the solar system happened, the Earth happened, life happened, we happened, eventually after 3.5 billion years of biological evolution, then you're going to have to posit that this probably happened repeatedly in the universe. Otherwise, if
Sure,
life is
yeah.
unique to the Earth, then it suggests there's something extremely special about the Earth, and that kind of
Absolutely.
drags you right back to special creation now, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
the belief has been for a long time that there must be life out there, and life like us, because you want to play the odds on all of this. But there are 3 lines of evidence, and I've written about this, 3 lines of evidence that indicate we are alone in the universe. One of them is the fact that we've been discovering exoplanets now for almost 30 years. These are planets orbiting other stars. The number of exoplanets is well over 5,000. It's soon to approach 6,000.
Wow.
And if you would have asked people 30 years ago, asked scientists, astronomers, when we found 6,000 exoplanets, how many would be Earth-like? They'd say, oh, probably hundreds of them.
Sure.
Well, we haven't found any yet.
Yeah.
They're all non-Earth-like. There are a few they try to spit and slide under the door, but they can't, because there are just real problems, usually with the stars that they orbit, not the planets so much. So right there, you've got 5,000, almost 6,000 data points that tell us that hey, the Earth is extremely rare, to the point of perhaps being unique. You'll never know until you check all the data, but
Of course,
at some point you have to say, well, we got enough data to reach a conclusion here. But you know what? Scientists aren't making that conclusion, even though they make conclusions every day based on far less data. Another line of evidence goes back to what's called the Fermi paradox. This happened over 70 years ago, and Enrico Fermi, the famous physicist, was having a discussion with other people over lunch, and they're talking about alien life, and he said, "Well, where are they?" And the idea was, if alien life like us is pretty common in the universe, then you would expect that we would not be the head of the class. There are probably some other civilizations that are way ahead of us technologically, and they certainly could have traveled here and come to the Earth, and they haven't done that yet. So where are they? Now, I know people are going to argue that we've been visited by spacecraft and all this kind of stuff, but there's no real clear evidence that's ever happened. So Fermi didn't think so, and I didn't think there had been any evidence like that, and it's not any change today, I don't believe. And the third line of evidence is from what we call SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and this is listening in on alien transmissions. We've been broadcasting AM for radio for a century now. So if there were a civilization with 100 light years of the Earth and they turned a large radio dish towards the sun, they wouldn't see the Earth, but if they had a very fine tuner, they could actually pick up radio broadcasts that leak through the Earth's atmosphere, television broadcasts, and so forth. And hopefully they would recognize that there's some sort of intelligent signal, though you may not know from the programming on the radio and television that there's any intelligence there, but hopefully they think some sort of intelligence behind the signal they're getting. Yeah. And over the past, the first SETI experiment was done in 1960, and it's expanded quite a bit. There are at least 2 programs now going 24/7 looking for signals, and the rage back in the 90s was to download some of the stuff on your laptop computer or your desktop computer, so that when you're watching cat videos or whatever on YouTube, you can actually do some science in the background. The people looking for intelligent signals, because you see they probably generated terabytes of data of signals they've looked for, and every bit of that they've never found a single signal indicating any intelligent life out there. So they got 3 lines of evidence, each of them converging on the conclusion that's warranted scientifically that we're alone in the universe. And what you indicated before from scriptural arguments, I think we are alone in the universe. So the science is kind of agreeing with us at this point on the fact that we're probably unique to this universe. God made the universe just for us.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, those that would say, we have been visited, looking at UFOs as evidence, it's such a huge giant leap to say just because you see a craft in the sky that somehow that's evidence that they've traveled from across the universe. I mean, that just means you see it's in the sky. It doesn't tell you
whatever it is,
where it came from. Yeah. So
I've never seen a flying saucer. So, and even though I've been a student of the sky for well over a half century, I've never seen anything I can't explain. There have been a few things that bedeviled me for a while. It took me a while to figure them out. I keep in my mind, at least not physically, but figuratively in my head, a UFO file and an IFO file. The IFO file is identified flying objects. And currently my UFO file is empty. My IFO is crammed full of things. So I think people that think they're seeing things in the sky many times are seeing other things and not realizing what they're seeing because they've not been a student of the sky like I've been.
Yeah.
By the way, have you ever seen a Starlink constellation shortly after it launched, like a few days later?
No, I mean,
I've seen it several times. First time I saw it, I had me going. 60 bright lights in a row moving across the sky.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Huh. It's really interesting.
If you really believed in flying saucers and you didn't know what it was and you saw one of those, you would swear that there was an armada of invaders hitting the Earth. It is really incredible to see.
That's wild.
It is.
I heard your presentation on this topic, and I thought it was great. But I think even if you're like a believer of UFOs, the point I was trying to make is that even if it is like a bona fide unidentified craft, that is still is not. It's just no evidence that that's traveled across the universe. So, or even from another planet, right? So, even the UFOs is really not evidence that we are that there's life on other planets, right? There's a lot of other explanations for what this unidentified flying object could be. But as you said, I like your method. I mean, you want to be rational and reasonable and consider that perhaps what you perceive to be an unidentified flying object has another explanation. I think you've already addressed this, so this might be a bit of a clarifying question. You mentioned earlier in Ezekiel, the firmament there is a firmament rather than the firmament, so it's going to be an expanse that's not quite like what's being described in day 2. And in Revelation, we see the same thing where there's a glass sea that's separating the living creatures from God himself on his throne. And you already mentioned that you believe that the waters above are in fact liquid water rather than like ice, right? So because someone might look at that sea of glass and think, well, perhaps this is the waters above that in fact frozen. Would you see the sea of glass described there as just a firmament that you were describing earlier?
Maybe. I mean, as opposed to the expanse of some sort. Got to keep in mind that both Ezekiel and John in this book of Revelation are trying to describe the indescribable. And if you look very carefully at their language, they are struggling big time. They use similes many times. It's like this, it's like that.
Sure.
Because they're having a vision in the glory and the presence of the Lord. And I think if we had witnessed it, we would be at a loss for words too. So he's struggling. Both of them are at that point.
Yeah, that's true, because we see the seraphim and the cherubim. Sometimes we see 4 wings, sometimes we see 6 wings, and sometimes we see a 4-headed living creature or cherubim. And then other times we see there's 4 creatures with each with a different head. So I
read this and I'm trying to visualize what he saw, and I can't put it together. It really is difficult.
So that's a great point. Okay, cool. So I want to diverge still on the topic of astronomy on just a couple more questions, and one is on dark matter. Do you have any leaning on a possible explanation for what dark matter is?
You mean the identity of what it is, or?
Just an explanation. Again, that might be. I just figured I'd toss it out there.
Well, if I knew what dark matter was, I would have get a Nobel Prize in physics.
Sure.
It's that big of a question. I can identify the questions. I can't do the answers too well, though. Now, dark matter is something that a lot of people have doubt. A lot of Christians have doubts about, but I'm very bullish on it. A lot of Christians I've found are very skeptical. I think they read about dark matter in context of what it can do in the Big Bang cosmology or galactic structure, evolutionary ideas. But these ideas are fairly new, going back 20, 25 years. The real evidence for dark matter goes back about 90 years. The very first evidence was from a guy named Fritz Zwicky in the 1930s, was looking at clusters of galaxies. You've got galaxies each contain a few hundred billion stars, are really big, maybe 100,000 light years across, like the Milky Way is. And we could see this clump of these galaxies sitting here. Just obviously, they're gravitationally attracted to one another, so close to one another like this, and presumably they're kind of orbiting around a common center of mass. And so, what Zwicky did is he pushed the technology of his day and measured in line of sight velocity. You can't measure the sideways velocity, but you can measure the inline. So the thing's going like this, you would get a snapshot of its motion as it's moving toward or away from us. Use the Doppler shift to get that. And if you measure a few dozen of the galaxies in a cluster of galaxies, measure their Doppler motions through spectroscopy, then you can get an idea of the average orbital velocity. And the average orbital velocity will then tell you something about the mass of the cluster. And we call this the dynamic mass because it's based upon the dynamics of gravitational attraction. Now, we've also spent a lot of time over the past 100 years working out what's called a light to mass ratio. And the idea is if you have a galaxy The more mass the galaxy has, the more stars it will have. The more stars it will have, the more light that it will have. And we can work out that relationship. Turns out for about one solar mass of material, you get about one solar brightness of material. So all you have to do to determine the mass of a galaxy, or in this case, a cluster of galaxies, is just measure how bright each galaxy appears. And knowing roughly the distance, you can calibrate that and then apply the mass to light ratio, and you get the lighted mass of the galaxy. Well, when Zwicky did this, he found out the lighted mass was only a tiny fraction of the gravitational mass. That is, if they're gravitationally bound, it would require far more mass than we can account for. And he wrote in German or Dutch. No, it's German, I guess. He was Swiss. He wrote Dunkelmatter, which translates, you can figure out, translates directly as dark matter.
Dark matter.
And for many years, astronomers called it missing mass. They didn't like that term. It really wasn't until, and there are other lines of evidence too, rotation curves of galaxies, for instance. But this all changed in the 1970s. A woman named Vera Rubin, working with an instrument maker named Kent Ford, they had a series of papers going on throughout the 70s looking at rotation curves of galaxies. You get a spiral galaxy sitting here, and it's spinning, or presumably it's spinning. Things are moving closer towards you on one side and away from the other, so it indicates there's orbital motion going on. And they simply measured the orbital motion all the way across this thing. Now, right in the middle, the motion is going to be horizontal like this, so you don't tangential, so you don't see any motion, but on the edges you see more. And when you do this, you can act as a probe of the mass. You can go out so much mass here, 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 and so forth. When you have orbital motion, all that matters in your orbital motion is what matters closer to you. So if you got an orbit this size and there's matter outside of that, well, that doesn't affect your orbital motion. Only what's closer to the center than you. So as you go farther and farther out like this, you can act as a probe to measure what the mass distribution is. And when you look at these galaxies, there's a central condensation of a lot of light in what we call the nuclear region of the galaxy. It looks like the preponderance of the mass is in that nuclear, close to the nuclear region. That's what the lighted mass tells you. But when you do the analysis with the probe, you find out that the greatest amount of mass is very far away from the center, where there's hardly anything out there. It's an inverse relationship.
That's wild.
And when Rubin and Ford did this in the 70s, it took a while, but by early 1980s, astronomers finally threw in the towel. They had resisted this for 50 years. They didn't go running headlong to it. They didn't like it, but they finally reluctantly came to grips with the reality of dark matter is there. And then it was the next decade or so, they began invoking it in all sorts of evolutionary ideas. But, we creationists like to talk about two types of science. So we have what's called operational science. That's observational and experimental science. And then we have historical or origin science. Paleontology would be historical science, trying to tell you what the rocks were telling you about the past. Geology, you can go out and study the worlds that now exist, but paleontology is telling you how the world existed in the past. Same thing's going on here. The evidence for dark matter is operational science. It's in the here and now. We can test it right here and now. But when you start invoking it to explain galactic structure and evolution of the galaxies and the evolution of the universe, that's historical or origin science. And I would think the creationists of all people would see the difference there, but I'm having a hard time convincing a lot of my fellow creationists that dark matter is real. And to me, it's amazing. We know a lot about the universe today, but as much as we know about it, we don't know what 90% of the matter of the universe is. I haven't a clue what it's made out of. And to me, that's fascinating. It's wonderful. It tells me that God has held back certain things from us that I think he wants us to explore and understand this world. And to me, it's a God-honoring thing to do this. Why would you just say, well, it doesn't exist? I don't understand people like that.
Yeah. I think I read this in a book written by Tom Horn. He was speculating. And of course, he doesn't have any real credentials in this field or anything. But it does sort of remind me of Elisha when he opened up, I guess, his servant's eyes to see the army of angels in the sky. There's things that are occupying that space that we cannot see. And so that was his speculation that could it be that within this heavenly realm where we know angels exist, that they're taking up matter. We just simply can't see it.
Well, I can't shoot that. I don't like that suggestion, but on the other hand, I can't say it's wrong because, again, I've confessed to you, I don't know what dark matter is.
Yeah.
And I would love to know what dark matter is, not just because they got a Nobel Prize, just because it's a cool thing about the creation. And I'm hoping in my lifetime that somebody will finally elucidate what it is. We've been trying this and that and haven't been able to feel what it is yet.
Yeah, but hey, like you said, it's nice to know that there's still so much yet to be discovered. All right, so this will be my last question, and that is about. So I mean, there's astronomy, and then there's astrology, and perhaps there's somewhere in between, some middle ground. But there are constellations that I think both astrologists and astronomers would look at. And we see, I'm thinking about verses like Revelation, passages like Revelation 12, that have been used just to say what we're seeing here is a constellation. And of course, we know, again, that the heavens declare the glory of God. And that's, part of what Paul's point was, that the heathens, they didn't have the word of God, but they did have creation to witness God. So my question is when we look at the constellations, do you give any credence to the idea that the constellations themselves can tell us a story? There are books written about how the constellations collectively can be seen as giving us the story of the gospel. So are they signs? And are they witnesses? To what extent do they actually witness to us?
What you're describing is what is usually called the gospel in the stars.
Right.
And you're right, there's several books written about that. Frances Wollaston wrote the first book about, in fact, she invented this whole thing in the 1860s. I think her book was published around 1865, a year or two after her death. Her book was not quite complete at that point. And I think there was somebody before who suggested something like it, but she actually took it to the nth degree. And then E.W. Bullinger and Philip Seiss. Bullinger was English, Seiss was from Philadelphia here in the United States. And around late 1880s, early 1890s, they wrote their own books based upon Wollaston's claims. And I consider them secondary sources on this. Wollaston's a primary source. And then there are other books written after that I consider tertiary and quaternary sources. I've got on my shelf behind me at least a dozen books on this notion. I first heard about it more than 40 years ago. I've been investigating. I've written about it quite a bit, actually. And I find it pretty poor scholarship, as it turns out. What Wollaston did is she realized the paganism you find in constellation and star lore names. Mm-hmm. Even the Venerable Bede was offended by that a bit, and people over the years have tried to Christianize them. What she did is she tried to repurpose them, said that there was originally a primordial gospel that was garbled into astrology and all this other pagan stuff. Right. But there's no real evidence of that. She just kind of created it. And what she did is she went through lexicons of Hebrew and other ancient Semitic languages looking for homophones similar to those, some of the words, like Deneb. She is the name of a star in Cygnus. In Arabic, it means tail because it marks the tail of the swan. But she found Deneb, God is my judge, I think, or God judges, I think was what she was picking from that. And she found meaning in some star names that didn't start appearing on star charts until her lifetime. So and she assumed they were ancient names, but they weren't. One was Valikan and one's Rotanev, and they actually started appearing on star charts in the early 1800s. There's a story behind them where they came from, by the way, and we know where it came from. So her scholarship is really lacking. But let me cut to the chase here. There are a few constellations mentioned in the Bible. One of them is Orion, very favorite constellation of a lot of people. If you look at these Gospel of the Stars books, they talk about Orion being a type of Christ. And if you look at the Hebrew word for Orion, used three times, twice in Job, once in Amos, the word is Kasil. And it's one of the two Hebrew words translated fool. There are two fools, one who is the impious one, and the other who's just not very wise. And it's the latter type, not being very wise. So, excuse me, but Jesus Christ is not a fool.
No.
And in fact, that's offensive to me. It's blasphemous to me that, you had right there, if you really could read the Hebrew, you would see that the word God chose to use, or is used in Scripture for Orion, is fool. And how dare you try to give it some other meaning to that? And to me, that's a very damning sort of thing. It really causes it to unravel. As I said, I've written a lot about this. I've put 3 chapters in one of my books I've written about at least one lengthy article on it. It's found at the website of my employer, answersingenesis.org. If you go there and just simply type in the search engine we have there, Gospel in the Stars, you'll find that article and other articles that I've written about it. So I've been a big critic of this, and I think there's nothing to it.
Awesome. Okay. Got it. Yeah, so what's happening in Revelation 12, you wouldn't put that, would you separate that entirely from any type of constellation?
Yeah, I find it interesting. There was a big to-do 6 years ago. I think it was 2017 September,
right.
where and I wrote an article about that too. It's on our website, and it got kind of recycled this year, repackaged actually, and nothing became of it. So I really don't think the constellation Virgo is what's being talked about there.
Yeah. Okay.
Every September or so, the sun spends a month in that constellation, and in that month, the moon is down near the feet of where Virgo would be, and then from time to time, planets such as Venus and Jupiter and such pass through it, and you can read into that whatever you want. But in 2017, there were people who were expecting the Lord's return, and I don't think it happened.
Yeah.
I've counted up in my adult lifetime, I've been through 10 ends of the world. So,
right. Yeah, and that certainly is a lot of people's go-to. You can see people can come up with some fantastic conclusions by reading so much into the constellation, the stars, and that sort of thing. So, good. So I'm glad to hear your take on that. You give me some more to maybe read and look into.
All right.
So that's all I had prepared. I want to thank you for coming on. This is a great interview. So, please let those who are listening, where they can find what you've written on. Let us know of anything that you're working on currently, and any final words, and I'll have you close this.
I'll just direct you back to our website, answersingenesis.org. It has most of my articles there. And I've have half dozen more books, and you can order most, if not all, of those through Answers in Genesis in our bookstore there as well.
Sweet. Awesome. All right. Well, will you close this out in prayer?
Sure. Father, we thank you for this past hour we spent together getting to know each other a little better, and also discussing your creation and your word. And I ask, Lord, that you'll use the information we talked about today to encourage people, to answer some of their questions and strengthen their faith. And that we ask, Lord, that you and you alone will be glorified and honored by all that goes out from this program. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with somebody you know. And with that being said, we'll catch you on the next one.